Thank you, Stephen. A really fascinating, practical presentation. And, we are often so criticized in the red meat industry for the way we produce. And so if anybody asked, to show them what it is we're doing, I think I'd point them to your presentation. So congratulations on that.
What I'll say there too, sorry, is that we don't see ourselves as any different to a lot of other producers, So if you go out there into producer land, you'll see many, many examples of this kind of thing happening. And I think we just as an industry need to be better at communicating that to our consumers, to our stakeholders, to investors, because there's a hell of a lot of good stuff happening out there and we should be really proud of that. I don't see this as a defensive position for our industry. It's an opportunity for us to articulate how well we operate on a global stage, and we should be really proud of that.
Absolutely. Very, very, very good final message, I think, from us. You've been very patient, and so we don't have a lot of time, but we are really keen to hear from you. If you have any questions, please present them now. I'm having a hard time. Now, surely there's going to be one question out there.
I've got one to start.
Doug has got one. Yeah? All right, please.
Work? Does this actually work?
Yeah. Yep.
One for Stephen and one for Doug as well. Stephen, how much is offsets part of your carbon neutral kind of share at the moment? And Doug, what's MLA's sort of assessment of how much purchasing offsets outside the sector is going to contribute to the net carbon thing, over the life cycle of your program?
Yep. So the way we went about that is because last year was the first time we measured our footprint, so we had to offset 100% of our footprint, and this is only about 10% of our business we're talking about here. So we're still selling the majority of our cattle into our two major customers. So this is a project we've just started. It's less than 12 months old. So we'll have our footprint measured again next month in April, and that'll tell us how much what we've been doing has had an impact on our carbon footprint. And there's always complexities there because there's been drought and things like that, and that's why we look at things like emissions intensity as being a really important measure. I noticed, I think the slide that you put up there earlier, Jared, was pretty interesting around emissions intensity, and I'd hazard a guess that the countries that are probably at the lower end are the ones that probably feedlot their cattle the most, and the ones at the other end are probably more towards the grass-fed, so Uruguay and some of the South American countries. So that's an interesting thing because feedlotting is a big thing in Australia, and it's actually a really efficient way to produce red meat. And the other one that's interesting, I know we've got to get to Doug here, but is the whole thing about hormones, right? So HGP pills accelerate growth, therefore the animal gets to market quicker, and the carbon footprint is lower. So it's a really interesting dynamic because we're always managing customers' expectations around hormone use, but then there's also the methane question. So both those things happening at the same time is an interesting thing to manage.
My response to the question around MLA's view, MLA is focused 100% on research and development activities that enable technology adoption, or unearth technology and then enable adoption. So purchasing offsets is not part of MLA's strategy. But there's a clear difference between what MLA does as an organisation and then what commercial businesses do. My other comment is businesses purchase offsets when technology and practice change is more expensive than an offset. It's a simple economic decision. Now, there's a reason why that occurs in this country. So we've got to do the R&D to reduce the cost of technology and practice change so that producers can take direct action. And I think Steve conveyed that in their longer term plan. They're seeing different technologies coming on board, and it's a big role for MLA to help make that happen with research and development commercialisation partners. But MLA's scope, we can't go and purchase offsets on behalf of industry, and that's not part of our plan. We're focused on technology and practice change measures.
Can I invite another question from the audience? Please go ahead.
Doug, Sarah Day from AACO here. When you put up the percentage of, or beef's percentage of the Australian total emissions, you do it as a percentage over time, but we saw this morning that Australia's total emissions is probably going to come down, whereas agriculture's role in as a percentage of that will increase. What's the transition from that graph to something which actually demonstrates the reduction in emissions over time? Does that make sense?
Maybe have another go for me.
So the graph that you put up previously had...
Yeah, it's a bar chart. Yep.
Yep. Had the emissions as a percentage of the Australia's total emissions.
Yep.
But over that time, hasn't Australia's total emissions gone up and beef's percentage of that has gone down? But
So-
then this morning we heard that over time, Australia's total emissions will go up and agriculture and beef's role in that will increase.
Yeah, so if I'll have an attempt at answering I think what is the intent of the question. So the beef industry, and I'll talk more the red meat generally, including sheep meat and goat meat production as well. The industry's contribution to Australian emissions has halved in that time frame. The data set that I presented has also shown that total Australian emissions have also reduced in that same time period, which is 2005 to 2016. So if your answer is what is the net result for Australia and the significance for the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative, if domestic emissions continue to reduce and the pace at which, or the trend in which that increase is higher than the Australian red meat industry's contributions, our net contributions are going to grow over time, and therefore our industry's significance in the global and in the Australian contribution is going to become more and more important. But the trend at the moment is the reverse. So our emissions reductions are outpacing the economy's emissions reduction, which is a great thing for our industry. Now, however, there are some complications in how we report the data. So, and that's a statistical issue that we need to resolve. So the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory is a data set that is separate to, for example, the data set that's collected under the Emissions Reduction Fund and the projects within it. It's also a separate data set to the one that industry runs around certain aspects of the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative. So there are some discrepancies in data collection. I mean, to your point, Steve, about Jared's numbers, I mean, I question the 20 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions per tonne of hot standing carcass weight. I did a quick calc as you were talking. I think it's actually half that number. So, you know, there are some real discrepancies in accounting systems in place. But ignore the absolute numbers. It's the trend that's most important. Whether the absolute numbers are slightly in or out, the trend over time is what really counts. Our numbers are trending in the right way as industry, which is a great thing. There are reasons for that, and we've got to make sure that trend continues. Because if the consumer interest in this area trends the other way, we've got to make sure we're coming out on the right side of the ledger.
I think the other thing, just to add to that, is we need to be really careful how we communicate this to producers, because there's a risk of overcomplicating it, an already very complex situation. So the way we need to articulate this to them is around how do you become more productive and more efficient, and what are the things that you need to do in your business really specifically and practically that are going to help you to get there. So, we need to make sure that gap between the science and the people talking about it in places like we are today and the producers is not great. It needs to be one and the same. Otherwise, we're going to lose the connection there, and then you lose adoption and things like that. So that's really important.
Gerard, you wanted to make a comment?
I was just going to a quick comment. I think in the other aspect to the contrast between this morning and those others is that really if these technology options and so forth come through, as I was talking about, agriculture's share of what's remaining, or the red meat industry's share of what's remaining in a future state could be significantly less. And that's really where the investment and so forth come from. So that transition doesn't need to go the way that was depicted this morning. It can go a different way. And Doug's 100% correct with those numbers in terms of they're an international data set. And having worked in international organisations, and we've seen You know, we know that there's questions about that, and we've questioned the FAO about that data ourselves. But the problem is that in the absence of something better, people use those numbers, and you know they're used as assessments against our industry. So we need to be on the front foot.
I think irrespective of the numbers, the jobs that we need to do on farm are no
Yeah,
different.
exactly.
So, to Steve's point, let's not overcomplicate the message with numbers and baffle
Yeah.
people with that. Let's just stay focused on what the science tells us we need to do.
Sure. Yeah. I want to take advantage, Mario, of your experience with at the international level with the impact of climate change, and specifically, we know that climate change will affect different countries in different ways. How do you see that playing out in terms of livestock production globally, the impacts of climate change?
Well, one of the critical impacts will be through feed production and land use. So, but in many ways, you know, it could favor, in many cases, the ruminant sector, especially when you're taking into account, say, Brahman animals that will be hardier than their counterparts in Europe, for example. Also, areas where we will no longer be able to grow crops simply because of the extreme climate variability might end up becoming also areas with increased livestock production. So, look, it's most of the analysis. If you look at the science, the impacts are relatively small partly because of the relocation of production, and also because some areas come into production as well. But, well, you know, with the impacts of climate variability and especially drought after drought, that's something that we still don't know enough about how it will.
And is that something that on Australia's production system, given that it is largely extensive
Yes.
on you know, land that's maybe a bit more susceptible to climate change, is what do you think a future strategy needs to include for Australia to, you know, continue to produce under climate change and even to prosper?
I'll pass the buck to Doug because he's probably better prepared to answer that question than me.
I was actually on a different planet thinking about the next question, but I think what I was thinking about was related to this in the future scenarios. I was interested in your presentation, Mario, in terms of what we eat impacts the environment and our health. It's also how much we eat.
Yeah.
So I thought we can't ignore what we eat with the volume of the product. And, you know, Australian agricultural industries have been so good at producing food at a price point that consumers are looking for. But then we have things like the Australian Dietary Guidelines that tell us actually what we should be eating. And if you look at the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which is 73 grams of unprocessed meat every second day, that's about 14 kilograms per year. The average consumption is significantly more than that.
Yeah.
Now, that begs the question, doesn't mean we need to reduce red meat production in this country. The question I ask is, how do we extract greater value? You know, we want to double the value of agricultural products. We know what we should be consuming for health benefits and environment benefits. Why don't we get smarter about how we market individual products? Instead of certain product categories, look at smaller portions, delivered to a larger audience. So you're still shifting the same volume of product, but the per kilo price doubles.
Exactly.
Why aren't we going down that? And I question the logic. I've heard it a couple of times today that consumers won't pay for environmental services. Well, I think, well, we're not really marketing it that well. So I think we need to be better at that because there's opportunity there. Because how else are we going to double? We can't double production. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a critical point. You're talking about value adding at the primary gate level. You're adding an attribute to a product. And when you look at the numbers, well, we're 3% of global beef production. So it doesn't matter if individuals eat less as long as we supply what consumers want. So.
Yes, and a very good example is Uruguay, for example. They realized very quickly that they could not compete with Brazil and Argentina on volume. So, I mean, it's not the size of Australia, of course, it's a small country, but they went for full traceability and environmentally produced beef. And look, China pays pays them an enormous premium for their beef, and then Uruguayan seed Brazilian beef as a result, basically. But they're exporting absolutely everything. But for example, initiatives like what Stephen presented, it's exactly the way to go, you know, really exploiting that kind of almost niche market, well-communicated niche market, showing that this is a very high-quality, very environmentally friendly product. And you will see that consumers will get choosier and choosier, and they will demand that kind of product more often. And then the other side is that, well, there's going to be demands to be met elsewhere as well. So well-produced, efficiently produced Australian beef could actually make it into other markets as a result and be beneficial in terms of reductions in emissions for the whole global sector, because other places would be very inefficient.
Yeah, so something to encourage the consumer to pay for quality. We have another
Got to
question up here.
exercise too, Doug. Don't forget that.
True.
Yeah, Mark Barber, Elders Rural Services. Probably a question more for Stephen, but for the panel in general. If we turn this around a little bit on its head, and the investment community, which are largely funded by the consumers that we're talking about, are showing much greater interest in the ESG credentials, of which carbon and greenhouse gas emission management is a part, are showing a much greater interest in the credentials of the investment vehicles they're putting their money into. So to what extent, Stephen, do you think the institutional investors in NAPCO have shown an interest in this? To what extent are they communicating what you're doing back to their constituents? And do you think it gives you a competitive market in capital raising, competitive advantage in capital raising?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Absolutely. So we've got a very close relationship with QIC, our major shareholder, and ESG is very high on their radar across all their asset classes. So we're having to report, disclose a lot more of that kind of thing to our board and to our investors. So there's no doubt that's become the norm. I think in the investment landscape, ESG is very high on the radar. There was, I guess the question is, how does that stack up against returns, and how do you incorporate climate initiatives into your business, but continue to grow returns? And that's a challenge that we've got, because a lot of this stuff adds to your cost base in your business. So we need to continue to find things through this R&D process that are going to accelerate productivity and efficiency, because they're the things that people are going to take up throughout the industry. And there was actually an interesting article yesterday around the Rio Tinto CEO was questioning their stakeholder base around, were they willing to take a reduced return in order to accelerate their climate initiatives? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's an interesting question to pose. But it's a really good question, and there's no doubt the ESG credentials of any business, particularly in agriculture, are right at the top of the list for potential inflow of capital globally.
Okay, really regret calling this session to a close. Thank you very much for your patience, moving rooms, and also with the technical difficulties. If you have more questions, I think that some of our speakers would be happy if you come down to ask them, and please give them a hand for their presentations.